Hi there, my name is Kenji Marui. I use he, him pronouns. I am part of the pastoral team with Grace United Church, and I was asked to put together a video that might explain a little bit about Remit 1, which is a vote that is before the church right now. Now, every time the General Council of the United Church of Canada makes a significant change to its polity or to its structure, a referendum occurs where every community of faith remits its approval or disapproval of the change. Now, that's why this process is called a remit, and one such vote is before the church now. What follows now is a recording of a presentation that I made to my church council that outlines a couple of timelines that brought us to this point in our church history where we are discussing this particular remit. I hope it answers a few questions and provides a broader context for the question that is before us. If we're talking about Remit 1, and the United Church of Canada and its restructuring, we also need to bring in the timeline of the United Church of Canada and its relationship to Indigenous peoples. And so I've prepared a little timeline to walk us through a brief history of the United Church of Canada, even though we begin at the beginning with 1925. Got the old blue hymn book. United Church of Canada was a union of Congregationalist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. Each of those churches needed to have some remnant of their identity contained within the new structure. So we have congregations for the Congregationalists. We had presbyteries for the Presbyterians, and we had Methodists for the Methodists, all under a national denominational council. Now, in the early days of this union, I would say there wasn't a lot of trust baked into the recipe. The Methodists were afraid that the Presbyterians would try to take over and make it into a Presbyterian church. The Presbyterians were afraid that the Methodists would take over and make it into a Methodist church. And so we built in safeguards and security measures to prevent any group from really taking over. So one of those instruments is called a remit. A remit is a referendum of any broad sweeping change that the national church would make, wherein each congregation has to remit their opinion as to whether it was a good idea or not. Anything that doesn't pass a majority of every single congregation, whether they know they're supposed to vote on this or not, if they don't reach that majority, then that change fails. And so that is something that we inherited into our new system of being a United Church of Canada. Also inherited into our system residential schools and the attitudes that went along with that. So that was 1925, 98 years ago. We did a whole bunch of things. There was a couple world wars, there was a depression, there was the first woman ordained in the United Church of Canada, first woman moderator. We made very progressive stances, positions made known on things like the rights of divorced people to be able to remain in church, powerful, important things like that. But I'm going to skip through most of that, and we're going to land at 1986 and 1998. 1986 is when the United Church of Canada made an apology to its Indigenous members, apologizing for the racism and the colonial attitudes that were held against our First Nations members for their spirituality, which was we had considered to be deviant and non-Christian and in need of reform. 1998 represents the apology made specifically for actions and harms conducted through residential schools. And so this piece of art is by Mervyn Meekus. Yes, Mervyn Meekus in 1986 to represent the apology that the United Church made to its Indigenous people. The dove represents the Spirit, and we know all about that. The dove is in our United Church crest. We like to think as people of God, we are the dove, we are the Spirit, we are peace. But in this rendering of art, it was the Indigenous people that represent the dove and innocence, and it was the eagle with the sharp beak and the sharp talons that was approaching the dove in the sky, and this would be the institutionalized church, and the tension and the interaction between these two bodies was captured in this piece of art and speaks to the tension between those two populations within the church, the non-Indigenous and the Indigenous. It's worth noting that in 1986, the Indigenous people acknowledged the apology. They said, "Thank you, we hear that you've made an apology. It has yet to be accepted." And the thinking there then and now is that words are nice, but we need to see some actions before we actually believe the apology to be genuine, to be true. So that's the atmosphere, the ethos in which we have been operating in uneasy alliance and tension with the Indigenous peoples of our church. It was in 2007 that the United Nations made a declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. It proposed that Indigenous people have a right to own property and own resources and have access and control over that. Proposed that Indigenous people have the right to make decisions about themselves for themselves, that they have the political power to do so, and that's going to be key in the development of our timelines here. So of the 140-some voters in the United Nations that voted on this declaration when it came forward in 2007, 7 countries voted against, and Canada was one of them. So good for us. Yeah. 2007 was also about the time that the Indian residential school settlement came into being. The lawsuit that Indigenous survivors had launched against the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and the United Church of Canada, and the federal government was settled out of court. And as part of the settlement, the Indigenous, the residential school survivors committed some of that payout toward a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So out of their own giving, out of their own reward, did they put this into being. It wasn't the government that created this. It was the Indigenous survivors that launched that. I should say, okay, so 2015 is when the report from the Comprehensive Review Task Group that was tasked with restructuring the church, that had engaged the church in how do we reconfigure the church, because presbyteries and conferences the system as we had wasn't working. So what might we do instead? And it was in 2015 that it presented its final report to the General Council in Corner Brook, where it was voted and decided that regions would become the combination of presbytery and conference powers be concentrated into regions, which is now the system that we are operating in, and we're still trying to figure out. But 2015 was also the same year that the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had begun 8 years ago came forward, and within those calls to action were a few items reserved specifically for the United Church of Canada, and for the church parties. about what we need to be doing within our structures and within our training and within our congregations to live into true reconciliation. 2016, I'll just mention a small press release, but the United Nations Statement on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is adopted by the United Church of Canada. And so it took a while to get from the initial document to actual buy-in from the Canadian government and the United Church of Canada. But 2016, we agreed that we would approve and act and implement these recommendations, including the one about the ability for Indigenous people to make decisions about themselves, for themselves, by themselves. So autonomy, self-autonomy, important there. 2018, calls to action to the church were presented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Calls to action to the United Church of Canada specifically came to us through the caretakers of the Indigenous Circle. They put together a very comprehensive document about how Indigenous ministers might be trained, how the Indigenous church might be structured and organized, how congregations might be supported, and this was adopted by the General Council in 2018 in Oshawa. And so that leads us up to 2022, which is, I guess, was the pandemic General Council. So there's the logo of that meeting with the candle and, of course, a little face mask, because we were all isolating and online and operating virtually. But it was in that General Council that the Remit material before us now was developed and passed. So the General Council approved the creation of a national Indigenous organization within the United Church of Canada structure, and made the request and took the action that the remit process that requires buy-in and approval from every single congregation be this national Indigenous church be exempted from having to do that. The thinking is that living into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the right to make decisions for themselves, by themselves, and not having to go to the colonial church, the quote-unquote white church, hat in hand, for approval to do things for themselves, when not every church even votes on remits when it pertains to them. They're certainly not going to vote on a remit that doesn't pertain to them necessarily. And so for them to be able to make changes the way they want, how they want, comes this recommendation, the action already taken, that this national church be exempted from the remit process. So we can look at this remit in a couple different ways. The first one is this is a restructuring piece of bookkeeping. And I've been told by other people within the Indigenous circle that it could also be seen as an invitation to decolonize the church and decolonize our structure and our process. And so that's a question or a dialogue that I leave before you here. Moving very quickly on into the timeline, a very specific time, October 20th, 2023. It's a Friday. Siloam United Church, 10 a.m. to 12 noon. There is in-person and Zoom information session about this and about the remit and what we might want to discuss or learn more about. That is an invitation for any and all who might be interested in that. So that's in North London, October 20th, with the final piece of our timeline being March 31st, 2024, the deadline for remit consideration. So our votes need to be in by this date in order to be tabulated. Any church that doesn't respond by this time will be considered a no vote, because that is the nature of the remit, because the church was designed not to change. And so that's how we've gotten to the place that we are now. So I will leave it off there, and I will say, I think one of the common questions was, certainly for us here in Sarnia-Lambton, Amjanong, St. Clair United Church, has been very visible and involved in our ministries in this area. Would we lose them if this national Indigenous structure came into being? Would we lose their participation, their involvement? And I believe, and the answer to that is no. They will be able to, I mean, every congregation is autonomous and gets to decide for itself how it relates into the church. But the National Indigenous Church and the United Church of Canada, you can hold dual citizenship, as it were, in that way. So I know that was a concern that was raised before. Funding-wise, things are in place. Many regions and the National Church have, for a number of years now, allocated some proceeds of every sale of real church property. So every church that has been sold, a portion of those funds had been held back exactly for the purpose of this national Indigenous structure to be created. And so that is going to be something that won't represent a financial burden or drain upon us. But that's a quick and dirty zip through the last 98 years of who we've been as a church, and looking forward into how we might go there as a church still committed to reconciliation and dialogue and moving forward.